I wonder how many miles I've fallen by this time, she said aloud. I must be getting somewhere near the center of the earth. Let me see. That would be 4,000 miles down, I think, but then I wonder what latitude or longitude I've got to. Alice had not the slightest idea what latitude was, or longitude either, but she thought they were nice grand words to say. Okay, that is so me. Moving on. Presently she began again. I wonder if I shall fall right through the earth. How funny it'll seem to come out among the people that walk with their heads downwards. The antipathies, I think. She was rather glad there was no one listening this time, as it didn't sound at all the right word. Okay, so Alice is just a whole mood. Got it. Either I am insane, which is unlikely, or Alice from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland has been criminally mischaracterized as being not of sane mind. To be clear, this video is not me being upset that Alice, a character written in 1865, has been misinterpreted through a 200-year-old game of telephone. Alice and her accompanying stories have been loved by millions of readers as well as many influential artists, and for good reason. In fact, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is what would be classified as, and probably began, nonsense literature. Nonsense literature is a subcategory of literature that balances some elements that make sense with some that do not, with the effect of subverting language conventions or logical reasoning. This description seems quite familiar in my mind, so I'm going to tell you another description, and you let me know if this sounds familiar to you. A movement that aimed to allow the unconscious mind to express itself, often resulting in the depiction of illogical or dreamlike scenes and ideas. This is the definition of the Surrealist art movement, which would not begin until 64 years after the release of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, pioneered by leader Andre Breton. I hope I am saying that right, as with all of the names in this video. Interestingly enough, the origins of both Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the Surrealist art movement bear similarities of their own. Andre Breton, born to working-class parents in 1896, studied medicine and psychology from a young age, eventually growing to professionally study medicine and undergo doctoral training. His studies were halted by World War I, which began his military career of handling traumatized and psychologically damaged soldiers, of which he applied lessons from teachers such as Sigmund Freud, who he had met personally, to better understand the minds of his mentally ill patients. This was the birthing place of Breton's ideas about the world and illogical reasoning, which would later be documented in his work, The Surrealist Manifesto. Contrasted to Carroll, whose real name is Charles Lutwidge Dodson, studied at Oxford as a mathematic professor. The common denominator between Breton and Carroll is their shared earning of formal, logical education. In short, we are observing a doctor and a mathematician who are both best remembered for their contributions to the Surrealist literary and art movements. This is the key of, in my opinion, what is most commonly misinterpreted when analyzing Alice in Wonderland and Surrealism as a whole. The point is not that Alice is kawaii or kooky or dark or twisted or alex.esc or any of this nonsense. Likewise, the works of Surrealist artists such as Dali or Magritte could hardly be considered abstract. They are not abstract and are often misinterpreted as being so. Surrealism does not seek to create something completely outside of the existing realm of human experience, instead choosing to ask questions about what is already in existence. Similarly to nonsense literature, it balances some elements that make sense with some that don't. What if we could grow larger? Why are we who we are? How does society determine logical and illogical thinking? Would readers enjoy a story that adheres to none of these logical principles? Well, the answer to that last question is a resounding yes. And not because Carroll spit anything his mind could muster up onto paper and sold it, but because Carroll understood and mastered the rules which he broke, similarly to Surrealist artists. That is what makes good, commentative, meaningful, and contagiously fun work. The language is witty, this boulder is precariously detailed, this manifesto is argumentative and logical in its challenging of logic. They know the rules before they break them, and the result is endlessly more fun and meaningful than if they had not understood the rules. And not only is it more exciting, but it is more relatable as well. This herein lies the root problem of why many people are unable to connect and relate to abstract art. The reason abstract and modern art can feel so difficult to empathize with and find meaning in is because it exists in a world that we literally do not. It challenges ideas that are unrecognizable and therefore unknowable to us. Contrarily, surrealism alters not exactly the fundamentals of our world, but the logic that applies to it, scientific or otherwise. To draw another comparison to abstraction here, surrealism essentially asks questions that are illogical on a scale. The questions vary in sense, and if you can relate to this question at the beginning of the scale that you can kind of understand a character asking, then simply by the chain effect, you can eventually relate to some of these more precarious, categorized as crazy questions that Alice asks later in the story. I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, so I'll give an example. The spectrum begins with a simple and easily applicable question. In the case of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, this simple question starts off as, say, what if a cake made me grow larger? Or take Through the Looking Glass, which asks a substantially more absurd question, what if our world and its causes and effects operated in reverse order? Some of the even more experimental and nonsensical questions asked by Alice include, what makes me me? Why aren't I this other little girl, Mabel? If I stay here in this hole for long enough, will I become someone who I like more? Through translation across media and modernization of these stories, the relatability of these questions are lost to being classified as nothing more than abstraction and lunacy. Abstract media, which Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is not, operates on its own spectrum of logic and creates and measures its own amount of sense. I hope this is making sense. Basically what I'm saying is it is difficult to relate to abstract art because it is going against logic, which is made up, and the logic applies to a world which also is made up, or does not exist. Surrealism, on the other hand, questions logic that is already in our world. Surrealism questions the things that actually exist in the world that we actually live in. This broader misunderstanding of surrealism in part contributes to Alice being mischaracterized as crazy. Alice is not crazy, Alice is a child. And this decision is entirely intentional, because if logic is a man-made convention, then it is adopted by people due to nurture a lot more than due to nature. So, who better to tell your story through than the eyes of someone who has not yet been tainted by man-made nurturing? A child. Surrealism as an art form captures childlike wonder purely by definition in its questioning of logical ideas. Ultimately, that is what makes Alice's Adventures in Wonderland come to life. The questions she asks, the logic she doubts, and morals she contemplates have little to nothing to do with where she is, Wonderland. In fact, her ideas are highly practical and applicable to real life, the real world. Wonderland is just a place for these ideas to live free, but it is her curiosity that brings the ideas to life. Similarly, I would argue that I would argue that Chuck would have been utterly useless in writing this story if not for the children who inspired Alice in Wonderland to begin with. He provided the literary components and the skill. However, this would have all been for naught if it was not for the children that he surrounded himself with, engrossing themselves in these tales and providing input of their own. In some ways, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is a case study of the childlike mind from someone who was directly observing children. And to a degree, that is deeply, deeply saddening, because this creep should have never been within a 10-mile radius of a child to begin with. The young girl who inspired Alice in Wonderland even went on to say that she was tired of being Alice, and felt exhausted by Lutwidge's obsession over her. Now, the reason I tell you all this is because I am really not one to believe in separating art from the artist. Who are we if not what we create? In this case, however, I do think it's important that we note Alice in Wonderland, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, have become something so much bigger than an isolated piece of art. It has essentially become a universe and subgenre of its own. With every remake, interpretation, adaptation, and appreciation that is created in the image of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the image surrounding Alice strays further and further from the source material, and consequentially further from Charles and his underage muse. Dare I say, this is actually something that I celebrate. Sure, it is a pity that the whimsy and the childlike elements are not appreciated in modern adaptations of Alice. However, a lot of these introspective observations into the mind of a child and illogical thinking, all of this whimsy came from a pretty immoral place to begin with. Maybe it deserves to be misinterpreted. I'm not going to go into the specifics surrounding the situation. There are some great videos and articles about it. There is no doubt in my mind that Carol Lutwidge was not a good person by any means. The reason I am abstaining from talking about any of it is because I don't want to immortalize that depiction of him, the girl who inspired it, the whole situation. It created the building blocks for surrealism to take flight, and that is what we should focus our attention to instead of the source material. In my opinion. You're very rarely going to hear me say that, but dead or alive, he's kind of got it coming to him that his work is going to be grossly misinterpreted. And with this added context of Lutwidge's character, there is yet another similarity we can draw between Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Surrealist art. Both were born out of tragedy. With Surrealism, it was the war for Britain, and in the case of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, it was Lutwidge's collection of underage friends. With this similarity, however, follows their most staggering and most important difference. While Alice's Adventures in Wonderland spawned from a place of exploitative obsession, Surrealism aims to truly understand the unorthodox and mentally ill mind from a place of informed and compassionate expression. Wonderland, much like Surrealism, is a parody. It wonders what makes us us and why we can't be, say, a pipe. It pokes at the holes in the fabric of our languages and customs and opens a very tiny door for nonsensical but highly intelligent adventures of our own. Now, for the rest of this video, I will be completing an artwork inspired by today's topic. If you would like to stick around for that, you are more than welcome to. If not, I hope you have a wonderful evening and good night.